What we're going to try to do is twofold. So I'm going to talk about a relatively new office within the City and County of Honolulu, talk about some of the process that we've been engaged in over the last several months around this idea of resilience and how we've gotten to disaster preparedness, disaster mitigation, disaster recovery as a very important focus area. And I'm going to provide some additional considerations as to what we consider Waikīkī. And then I'm going to hand it off to Rob, who will talk specifically about his center, the center that he works for, as well as some of the work that they had already been engaged in within the Waikīkī district that we consider Waikīkī proper. So with further ado, and I've been informed that this is just going to happen from time to time with the presentation. So we'll roll with it. So again, my name is Matt Gonser. I'm a new planner, just been with the city's new Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency since October of last year. Hopefully you recall that in November of 2016, the voters of this island overwhelmingly decided to create an Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency. This was a city charter amendment proposal back in 2016. You can learn more about the specifics of the charter mandate at our website, resilientoahu.org. The only other thing I wanted to really drive home on this slide is that the same amendment ballot measure that created our office also created a new city commission. So an official commission, liquor commission, planning commission, ethics commission, all those commissions, an official city climate change commission, 5 experts in the field of climate sciences who are obliged to inform the administration, city council, our office, and executives for all the departments on a range of climate change science, potential impacts to us here locally, as well as provide some recommendations on how to address and meet some of those challenges. Several months before that, Honolulu was admitted into what is called the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative, and this is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, a global philanthropy. We were an applicant each of the 3 rounds. We were selected in the 3rd and final round amongst 1,200 cities all those years. So we should feel very fortunate that, one, we were just given the encouragement to continue to apply, but also that we were finally selected. It does a few things. It immediately networks us with this global community of cities that are tackling these really pressing 21st century challenges around globalization, urbanization, and climate change specifically. It gives us direct access to a suite of for-profit, nonprofit, academic, and other institutions that we can tap into for discrete, specific pro bono services to help us address and meet some of those challenges that we identify through the process. And it also provides a framework and a guidance towards producing what they call a resilience strategy. So every city has to do 2 things: hire a chief resilience officer, who is Joshua Stambro. He's also the director of our office. And we also will ultimately produce a resilience strategy that will come out early spring of next year. That little red circle is just to show you where we are in the process. So we're wrapping up what's called the resilience assessment phase, and I'll talk more about that. And what's important as it relates to this presentation is that the information that I'm going to highlight from the assessment informs why disaster mitigation, disaster preparedness, disaster recovery is becoming one of those core discovery areas as we proceed. So Rockefeller considers resilience, and they talk about it in twofold: shocks and stresses. And you can think about shocks as these acute events, these moments in time. It's a punch to the gut. The consequences can be pretty severe, but hopefully over time, those impacts diminish. Oh, it goes all the way back to the beginning. That's unfortunate. So you can consider things like a hurricane, an economic crisis, other episodic events as those shocks. And the stresses are really those things that challenge us day to day. They sap our vitality as individuals, communities, government. These could be the long-term trends around climate change. These could be our ever-present intractable homelessness and affordability challenges. And the thing to consider about stresses is they can challenge our ability to perform and stay connected and stay strong in those moments of crisis, those shocks. So resilience, it can be pretty academic, it can be pretty heady, and we really just try to think about those shocks and those stresses and you know, having the capacity to survive, adapt, and thrive, and no matter what those shocks and stresses are, but we're a bit additionally challenged by the reality of global climate change. And what you see in front of you is that thin blanket that makes life on this planet habitable. I charted it. The drive from my office to here tonight is about the distance if you were to drive straight up. We think about the atmosphere as this boundless, vastless volume, but it's quite thin, and it does cover, obviously, the entirety of the globe. It's compared to the thinness of an apple skin to the apple itself. And we're adding more and more threads to this blanket that has kept us comfortable for some period of time. And we know what those sources are, right? It's every time we turn on a car, every time we use some form of electricity that's not renewable, we're adding more and more fibers to this. And the foundational science was produced and recorded here in the state, the top Mauna Loa. This is the famous Keeling curve, charting the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's charting very well with increases in global temperatures through that same time period. And it's not just globally. We've observed at least 1 to 2 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature in the state since the 1900s. So again, we know that we're adding more and more threads to this blanket. It's getting hotter and hotter. This heat is also energy, and it's looking for ways to express itself. And it's expressing itself in weirder and more extreme conditions. So the hazards themselves are still the same, whether it's a storm or a flood, but they're more and more extreme and more difficult to predict and more difficult to prepare for. And they're also getting more and more expensive, partly because where we actually have assets that could be impacted, but also just the sheer magnitude and size. And now they're being found in places that haven't historically suffered from such events. And we're also seeing that the gap between insured losses and uninsured losses is growing globally. Something like 70% of the homes that were impacted by Hurricane Harvey were uninsured properties. So they have very limited ability to recover as a household and get back on their feet. And there's certainly a myth of the amount of resources that FEMA can provide a household in a moment of crisis. And what's most important on this graph, it's a little old and it's a little faded, is the trend. So what this is actually showing is as more and more of these events happen, as they're getting more costly, the federal government is absorbing more and more of these losses. And this certainly is not a sustainable trend into the future. And we saw last year was the biggest payout from FEMA, which challenges their ability as we enter our new hurricane season. And they're already deployed well across the state with 2 disasters here in the last couple of months. And this certainly doesn't help just the sheer fact that disaster declarations have tripled since the 1970s. And again, it's not just out somewhere else. We're seeing a lot of this weirding and energy trying to express itself in new ways. We had a very active El Nino season in 2015 and 2016, where in that period we saw certain records, 11 days of record rainfall, 24 days of record heat, 9 months of drought. So these wide swings in the kinds of conditions. And it's not just those episodes. We've already seen changes in our trade wind days, less rainfall overall. And I think for anyone that was participating in the previous couple of lectures, a lot of information around sea level rise, particularly in Waikīkī. So the point is, we know that events will happen. And what are the proactive measures that we take either to mitigate those impacts or prepare ourselves for some different system, either through operations, agreements, different insurance schemes, or thinking about different designs. And Rob will talk a little bit about some of the investigation that they did with business communities down in Waikīkī. And I think we all remember this. This is, again, just to drive home the baseline condition of living on an island so very far away from other systems and other populations is vulnerability. And that's not to say that we're weak or ill-prepared. It's just an important recognition of where we are physically and something that perhaps we can consider wherever we live across this island and what that means in terms of our vulnerabilities. And when we were going out into community, we did about 6 months of pretty intensive public outreach. We had an online survey, we had a paper survey, we were doing in-person polling, and we were asking people to give us their perceptions around some of the challenges. To ensure geographic distribution, we utilized the neighborhood board system, and we're excited to say that next month we'll have gone to every neighborhood board. It's a great opportunity to see places that you're perhaps not familiar with, but also to gather information from people that are so committed and dedicated to their community that they're willing to serve and consider ways to improve their communities. A lot of anecdotes or a lot of people highlighting just pride in community, really stressing that that social fabric is something that is a strength for their communities. And we did just that. We asked them several questions around what makes you most proud as a member of this Oahu community, or however you define community. We asked them if there was, a magic wand and you could make an effect, some sort of change or important change immediately or tomorrow, what is that? But we also asked them to identify their top shocks and their top stresses. And you can see those listed here. And obviously, the combination of the shocks and the stressors are important for us as we consider what kind of research, what kind of resources, what kind of specific activities do we need to consider in a resilience strategy to effectuate as many of these as possible. And this is more just for me to explain the process. So we had this tool that was provided to us by the Rockefeller Foundation, where not only were we asking, what's your top shock, what's your top stress, we asked them to inform us of what is one specific thing or the most important factor that you think we need to do now to address that shock or stress. So these were shorthand answers. These were bullet lists. We had to do some coding and some factoring of those into this wheel that they consider the city resilience framework. The main point is there was some natural breakpoints in the information that people were providing to us. That remaining rooted is all about affordability. The bouncing forward is what we're here to talk about today. Exposure and innovation is both climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And the Laulima is all about really engaged communities lifting and leading us on these resilience challenges. Before I hand it off to Rob, I just wanted to expand our consideration of what we mean when we think about Waikīkī and how it relates to this shocks and stresses discussion. So Waikīkī, we probably think about it bounded by the Alawai Canal and perhaps Kapahulu or maybe the Diamond Head District. But Waikīkī I mean, we see these road signs all across the island. It's a significantly larger ahupua'a that extends from this dashed white line here, which splits Honolulu and Waikīkī, all the way out into Hawaii. I've seen even older maps that showed it wrapping around here into Hanauma Bay. So things to consider when we think about the visitor industry or the visitor district of Waikīkī, it's actually even a smaller component of what's called the Alawai Canal watershed, which is also a man-made fabricated system that was created after the Alawai Canal was created. So I just wanted to leave some of these stats up here for you to consider as Rob reinforces some of the important facts and figures about Waikīkī District as a smaller component of a larger system. And that watershed is pretty diverse itself. We have very short, steep watersheds here in the state. If you were to go back into Lion Arboretum, it rains maybe about 150 inches per year. Down in Waikīkī, it's about 25 inches of rainfall per year, though those trends are somewhat changing. I've lost it. And while we often draw ourselves to these pretty extreme events, such as the 100-year flood that's being modeled and analyzed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the state and the city, we know that we're significantly impacted from much smaller events, right? So this is some of the damage from the 2004 rainfall and the overtopping of Woodlawn Bridge area that affected UH Manoa, as well as previous overtopping of the canal in the early 60s. We know we have the stress of water quality impairment just from the sheer amount of impervious surfaces that have been collecting and transporting non-point source pollution down into the canal, out into the ocean. We also know that we are stressed by these trends of chronic erosion, further complicated by sea level rise. We also know that we have these very episodic events, these shocks, storm surge, high surf, hurricane, and tsunami. And this can be impacted by just aging infrastructure and infrastructure failure, which both and could be shock and or stress. So again, we know that we do have these challenges. We know that we will likely be affected by something at some point in time. You're never beyond an event, you're just in between hazards is probably a safer way to think about it. So what are the things that we are doing as city, as business, as residents, as community to address this in a specific area of Waikīkī? And that's where I'm going to leave it to Rob to talk about how we are considering fostering a resilient Oahu or fostering resilient Waikīkī in the face of natural disasters. Lastly, I'll just make a plug to go to our website, follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter, and you can stay informed about the progress as we migrate into this phase 2.
All right, thank you, Matt. Good evening. My name is Rob Porro. I have to say, it's really a pleasure to be back here. I actually presented here with someone in the audience, actually Mike Foley, about 5 years ago as a graduate planning student. And that presentation was on lessons from Hurricane Sandy. And so it's fitting that we're here tonight talking about resilience and recovery. My background is in coastal engineering, and in urban planning, I focus on coastal hazards. So I serve as the coastal program manager for the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center at the University of Hawaii. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we've done specifically in Waikīkī, like Matt said, related to pre-disaster recovery planning. And so what is NDPTC? If you haven't heard of it, we're a research and training center based at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Hawaii. We're funded by FEMA to develop training courses related to natural hazards and disaster management. Matt was probably better at this than me. Where am I? Okay. And because we're based at the Urban Planning Department, we incorporate planning concepts and principles into our training and focus on vulnerable populations. Because of our geographic location, we have a special focus on islands and coastal communities in our training. We're part of a national consortium, the National Domestic Preparedness Consortium. It's a consortium that's authorized by Congress, funded by the Department of Homeland Security. It includes 7 centers across the country. The first 6 were established after 9/11, so they focus more on man-made hazards. So explosive hazards, terrorism, radiological hazards, transportation-related hazards, things like that. NDPTC was added to the consortium after Hurricane Katrina, and obviously we focus on natural hazards. We are a national center, so we deliver training across the country. This is just a map of some of the training locations, actually all of the training locations we've delivered at, marked by the green dots. I think to date, we've trained up to 37,000 folks since 2010, when we were established. We have about 20 courses now. We have a group of courses that are specific to hazards, so give you information on the science and the preparedness for particular hazards. We have a group that's more general, kind of gives community resilience type information. Another group that focuses on tools for disaster management. And then last, but certainly not least, the planning courses, which gives you planning concepts and strategies for certain aspects of disaster management. One of our newest courses is called Community Planning for Disaster Recovery. And that was certified just a few months ago. It had been in development for a couple years. Certification was pushed really earlier this year in response to the multiple extreme events that we had last hurricane season and all the locations that are in recovery right now. So we pushed for certification on that. part of the research and development that went into developing that course included us undertaking our own recovery planning project for the topic of this month's lecture series for Waikīkī. And so that's what I'm going to talk about this evening, that project. The Waikīkī Pre-Disaster Recovery Planning Project, very creative name, but basically it's a partnership with the Waikīkī Business Improvement District Association, or the BID, how I'll refer to them from now on. It's a lot easier. We've worked with the BID for several years, doing various types of planning studies for them, anything from homeless counts to safety and cleanliness studies, all the way to counting gum on sidewalks and pigeons in Waikīkī. So really a diverse set of studies that the planning department is involved with. This particular project focuses on disaster recovery. Where's the mouse? And really, it's intended to start the conversation around recovery planning for Waikīkī and provide a roadmap for a more formal planning process. So it's not to develop a recovery plan for Waikīkī, but really identify what the steps are, what the questions that need to be answered are, and who needs to be involved. So we've thrown this term recovery around quite a bit already. Probably should define it. FEMA has a definition for it. It's there at the bottom. A sequence of interdependent and often concurrent activities that progressively advance a community towards its planned recovery outcomes. And this comes out of the National Disaster Recovery Framework, which is a FEMA doctrine. And this implies that there's some planning that takes place pre-disaster, and that's identifying priorities, objectives, goals of a community should it be impacted by disaster and find itself in a recovery scenario. The recovery continuum is this graphic here. It comes out of that doctrine, but it also shows that the process is this set of like overlapping stages, both before and after a disaster. So recovery is pretty complex. It doesn't start at a given point. It's really about these kind of concurrent activities and overlapping stages. I also have this picture in my presentation. So you have seen it. I know you've seen it. But again, this is the 2015 hurricane season. Obviously, it didn't all happen at once. That would be pretty scary. But this just, again, shows that it's not a matter of if, but when we're going to be impacted by a disaster. And so it's important to think about that now and think about what the steps we need to take and what the priorities and objectives are for recovery. So these are the main project elements of what now is phase 1 of the project. Currently, we're in what we're calling phase 2. But tonight I'm going to talk mostly about phase 1, which really the objective was to, again, provide that roadmap for recovery planning in Waikīkī. It included these steps here, doing some background research on the importance of recovery planning, what the principles are for recovery, conducting a vulnerability assessment on Waikīkī to specific extreme events, engaging the community to solicit feedback and input, and then finally providing a report which provides recommendations and a step-by-step process for recovery planning in Waikīkī. So why are we focusing on Waikīkī? Besides the fact that it's the topic of this month's lecture series, it is the economic engine of the state. As you can see here, almost half of the visitor industry activity happens in Waikīkī. If I remember those stats off the top of my head, I think almost 10% of the gross state product. That was pretty close. 11% of state jobs. On top of that, almost 30,000 people live in Waikīkī. On any given day, you might find up to 100,000 visitors there, and that's on top of the 34,000 employees that work in Waikīkī. So obviously, this is a very important district. And I should say that all of this activity and all of these stats right here happen in this 1 square mile piece of land that used to be, wetlands, basically. So it's pretty remarkable and pretty vulnerable because of its significance and exposure. Currently, there's not much related to disaster management planning specific to the recovery phase of the disaster management cycle, which is the circle you see in the middle. You see there's plenty of planning done for response. There's several done for preparedness, some initiatives related to mitigation, and really only one document at the state or city and county level that mentions recovery, and that's a state document which focused on economic recovery for the state, and that was done by DBET, I believe. So there's not much related to recovery, and there's nothing specific to Waikīkī and recovery. So the purpose of the project is to not only to increase the focus on recovery planning, but also to bridge that gap between what would be the response phase and what eventually would be a redevelopment stage, depending on the damages, and linking that to current community planning and development plans that are in place. As part of our research, there were certain elements that came to the surface as being important to include in a recovery plan. In our project, we tried to touch on the first four, get the ball rolling on those first four. If you were to continue down the planning process, you'd kind of hit each one of these along the wheel. But first one being the fact-based, why are you planning for recovery? What are the potential impacts? What are the goals and objectives? Second, what might a recovery organization look like? What authorities would it have? How would you ensure public participation in the planning process? And then lastly, what policies and what strategies might you consider to include in a recovery plan? So all of that was kind of that first step I showed in the previous slide, the background research. The second element was conducting a vulnerability assessment in Waikīkī and identifying what the vulnerability is to these three extreme events in particular. One, a 500-year flooding event, which we modeled using FEMA's HAZAS software. And then the other two hazards modeled by the Ocean Engineering Department, actually for a Sea Grant project. One is historical composite of tsunami inundation, and then storm surge inundation from a simulated Category 4 hurricane in Waikīkī. And that would be similar to Iniki, but kind of worst case scenario, making landfall on the south shore of Oahu. So we took those simulated model inundation layers and overlaid them with certain variables to look at social, economic, and physical vulnerability in Waikīkī. And so for social vulnerability, we use census data to look at certain variables such as population, ages, income levels, disabilities, things like that, to get a sense of the social vulnerability. And that's all associated, because it's census data, associated with residential parcels. And as you can see in the top left, those parcels are located mostly along the Alawai. Again, because it's an economic hub, we looked at economic vulnerability, and those variables included things like number of hotels in that parcel, hotel rooms, number of employees, sales activity, revenue, even land value and building values. So unsurprisingly, those big waterfront hotel areas are the most economically vulnerable because there's so much economic activity that happens along the waterfront. For physical vulnerability, we overlaid the inundation layers with critical assets like utilities and infrastructure, as well as critical facilities, to see which assets fall in each of these hazard zones. We also looked at the impacts at the building scale. So using the simulated inundation depths, figuring out what the estimated flood impact would be at each building relative to the base elevation of that building. So taking that information from the city and county's database and the tax map key information. So we used that vulnerability assessment information and the background research as a base to engage stakeholders from, to one, educate and just raise awareness on the topic of recovery planning and the potential impacts in Waikīkī, but also two, to solicit input, get feedback in terms of preferences on recovery strategies. And we use several vehicles to get that input: surveys, interviews, had a large workshop and some committee meetings. And I just want to highlight a couple of these vehicles. First, the Waikīkī Recovery Planning Workshop, which kind of served as a kickoff to our project back in 2016. Fairly large workshop. We had almost 60 participants there from a variety of sectors: government, nonprofit, associations, hotels, restaurants. So pretty good representation of the different stakeholders in Waikīkī. And we followed that up with smaller group planning meetings focusing on recovery authorization, operations in recovery, and then long-term redevelopment and recovery strategies. Each of these events, again, utilized that vulnerability information and had mapping exercises to spark conversation and solicit input. So at the workshop, we had the participants choose. We just had a blank slate and had participants choose among a set of recovery strategies and indicate where they'd like to see those strategies in Waikīkī. So some of them might be building back faster, building back stronger, greener, more equitably, retreating, accommodating, things like that. So the ideas varied pretty widely, but we were able to identify some trends and consensus in certain areas. And that's just our attempt at consolidating all these different ideas. The planning meetings, we also use the inundation layer. This is the storm surge and inundation and riverine combined, because that is a plausible scenario. A hurricane comes, you have storm surge and a lot of rain. And just to identify what areas you might think about relocating, intensifying development, or adapting existing development. And this isn't to say this is what should be done, but this was used as a baseline or a starting point for the conversation. And obviously, the ideas that came out of the planning meeting were very different from the baseline, which is fine. Again, it was something for the participants to react to, because we actually found that having that baseline got ideas flowing faster rather than the blank slate that we had at the workshop. So I should say that this is not a formal plan by any means. This is very conceptual. It's really almost the result of what was essentially a brainstorming session. And so some of the ideas that came out of the group were improving connectivity to Waikīkī, and improving the alawai, which was a general consensus, and the beach. So recognition of the natural resources and the importance to the vitality and resilience of Waikīkī. So all of that fed into the final step of the project, which was this report or roadmap. And we organized the report according to these three aspects of recovery that really stood out to us in the research as being more important. And that would be authorization, operations, and long-term redevelopment. We provided recommendations and next steps for each of these areas. For authorization, one of the recommendations in guidance and in our report is to establish a recovery organization prior to a disaster, and really outlining its authorities. And that recovery organization, it's important that it's formally established through some type of legislative vehicle. And so in the report, we provide some the jurisdictional level of that organization, and some vehicles to provide that authorization, whether it's a new ordinance or state legislation, or maybe more informally MOUs or MOAs between different agencies, or amending an existing ordinance. The second element of that, operations, we provided a sample recovery organizational structure. Again, just a sample for whoever does undertake this formal plan development process to work from. And we based it loosely on FEMA's ICS or incident command system structure, but modified it based on stakeholder input and what they thought was important. And the idea is that this organization would facilitate short to intermediate term recovery activities, so days to months after a disaster. And that operations liaison is very important because he serves as the link between that core recovery organization and the recovery activities. This is loosely based on FEMA's recovery support function structure. So in that National Disaster Recovery Framework that I mentioned earlier, FEMA lays out these 5 functions. We tweaked it a little bit, again, based on stakeholder input and what they thought was important as far as activities in Waikīkī. Once it transitions from intermediate into long-term recovery, kind of the responsibilities transition to a different committee is what we're recommending. And so in the report, we provide some potential strategies that might be considered to, one, reduce vulnerability either through regulatory measures like setbacks and things like that, or physical measures to increase resilience or adapt to these hazards. We also provide information on the stakeholder suggested strategies to make improvements to Waikīkī, and again, to make improvements to the Alawai Canal. Other considerations that we outline are to include input from an expanded list of stakeholders. So we are only able to reach a certain amount of people during our project, but the formal development process should try to include as much public input as possible. Second, it should align with existing planning processes. There's a lot of planning efforts out there that have objectives, have goals, have visions for Honolulu, for Waikīkī, and so any recovery planning should align with that, because God forbid we find ourselves in a recovery scenario, it does provide an opportunity to accelerate some of those actions that are outlined in those other plans. And then lastly, definitely should consider sea level rise, especially with the new data and reports coming out, because as you can see on the right, sea level rise will definitely have an effect on the impacts of these extreme events. So all of this feeds into this final report. Like I said, you can actually download this. We have a website. If you Google Waikīkī Recovery Planning, it's the first thing that comes up. Our website is, and you can go there and get information on the project. Let's see, I'm lost. Here we go. And download the report and read through it. Obviously goes into a lot more detail than I could in 20 minutes. But feel free, always welcome to feedback as well. So like I said, that was phase 1. That's the bulk of the project. That was about a year and a half long process. We're in phase 2 now. It's kind of these offshoot projects from that. Started earlier this year. One of the takeaways from our research was the importance of small businesses in recovery and the challenges they face after a disaster. And so the bid asked us to develop training for their small businesses in their membership. And so we're currently developing that training. It includes information on how to assess risks for small businesses, the types of financial assistance and insurance that's available for small businesses, and then also some tools for business continuity planning. We just had our first 2 workshops at the bid this week, and we used that opportunity to get some feedback and make some improvements to the training. We do have a larger workshop planned August 6th as part of the Pacific Risk Management Ohana Conference, or PRIMO. That's held at the Hawaii Convention Center August 6th through the 10th. That first day, August 6th, is meant for training. So you could go to the website there on the slide and get more information on that. The second element of this phase 2 is to identify lessons from Puerto Rico for Waikīkī and Hawaii. And this is happening in parallel to a project we have with Matt's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency. Basically, it's a project out of the Department of Urban Planning where we have a practicum class try to identify lessons from Puerto Rico to inform the development of the Wahoo Resilience Strategy that Matt mentioned earlier. And so we actually just came back from Puerto Rico a little over a week ago. and we were able to take the students there and assess some of the damages and meet the partners and stakeholders that we work with. We actually do a lot of training in Puerto Rico. We have for the last several years. So we have built some relationships with the university there, with NOAA, Sea Grant. We work really closely with them in Puerto Rico. And so we took the students there. I was pretty sure it was an eye-opening experience for them. I've been there several times, and honestly, every time I go, it's eye-opening to me. I'm always amazed at the passion and the talent of the people we work with there. But what really stands out, in addition to that, is the similarities of Puerto Rico to Hawaii. And just walking along this coast, these pictures are from the northwest coast of Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. It really just struck me how similar a situation we could find ourselves in, and really instilled a sense of urgency in me every time I go there. So with that sense of urgency in mind, we're hoping that this project, this Waikīkī Recovery Planning Project, is a starting point for a more formal city-led recovery planning effort. At the beginning of this project, we realized that it needed a champion at the city level to really get the ball rolling. We weren't able to do that. And the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency was not yet established when we started this project. But since they have been established, they really have taken the helm in pushing this idea of recovery planning and the importance of it. And hopefully that gains some momentum. But just having this conversation, having events like this, and hopefully starting the process, even if it doesn't result in a plan, I think is still a step in the right direction and will help increase the resilience of Waikīkī. So with that, happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
I see in your conceptual plan that you are promoting a wider beach. Given the fact that we're entertaining sea level rise, how are you going to expand it?
Well, I should say first, we're not promoting really anything here. This is just kind of a consolidation of some of the ideas that were thrown out. But so beach nourishment is a strategy in the toolbox for adaptation. Obviously, sea level rise, provides some challenges to the effectiveness of beach nourishment in the long run. In the short term, it could still be a valid strategy. At least to maintain the current beach. Expanding the beach, making it wider, that requires input from all the various stakeholders to come to a consensus that that's what's wanted in Waikīkī. But yeah, nourishment in the long run with sea level rise, it may not be as effective.
Hard to move the buildings.
That is right. Those are some big buildings. Yeah, and so, not surprisingly, none of the ideas that came out mentioned relocating the hotels. So, any other questions?
Federal property, what's happening with the federal property? That's a good area.
Halikoa, Fort DeRusi area.
Well, it's a big gray area.
Yeah, that's.
What's happening there? I mean,
So Fort DeRusi is a lot of open space. They have the museum there. Halikoa is a federally owned hotel. So the federal government does have a lot of property in Waikīkī. Yes, sir.
Was there a project done right in where he applied what happened in northeast Japan with that kind of magnitude tsunami, or you hit Waikīkī? What kind of station?
Not that exact tsunami, but the modeling that I mentioned earlier, the tsunami composite of historical inundation, that also included these hypothetical scenarios that haven't yet happened. But this is out of the Ocean Engineering Department. They do a lot of research on tsunami impacts, potential tsunamis that could come out of, say, the Aleutian Islands, things like that. So there's a lot of research being done on the potential impacts of a larger tsunami than we've ever experienced. But we personally at NDPTC, we don't, but we take that information and use it in our training and kind of disseminate that kind of information.
Was there any kind of like, what kind of devastation to Waikīkī from something like that actually happened?
Well, the modeling that we had just showed flood depths, and they ranged, I mean, if we go to, where was that? Okay, so it's kind of hard to see, but on the bottom right is the tsunami. The red line, I forget the scale, but it's greater than 8 feet of water there, and up to 2 feet of water extends well past the Alawai up University. So, I mean, the impacts is pretty drastic. There's a large area that's affected, potentially affected. If you actually zoom that out and see the whole South Shore, it's pretty scary scenario. And actually, all of those two maps in the bottom are available in PAC-IOS's sea level rise viewer. So you can see the whole South Shore.
You say that again?
PAC-IOS, PACIOOS. And so the new sea level rise report that came out recently, earlier this year, they put some information in PAC-IOS. Sea Grant has done other projects in the past where these two maps came from, are also on PAC-IOS. So it's a great tool if you haven't heard of it.
So watching what's been happening in Puerto Rico has been kind of terrifying, just living on water out here in the Middle East.
Yeah,
I think we've been incredibly lucky that we haven't had an event like that in the last 20 or 30 years. What are the main takeaways from that event that we could kind of look at for example?
Yeah.
A better position than they are.
Yeah. Well, this summer is where we're really diving into to really lay out the lessons. But like I said, what strikes me every time is just how similar it is. And so one of the things that that was mentioned from our partners, there's the importance of community level planning. There's a lot of planning that happens maybe at the state level or higher, but community level planning is really important to one for the community to kind of have a sense of ownership in whatever plans are in place for that community, but also that they're aware of the plans because we're involved in that process. So that was one of them. In terms of response, one of the things that we heard a couple times was that the first responder is your neighbor, so that building relationships with people in your community is really, really important to right after disaster, because it may take a while for help to get there. There's communities that we visited that were isolated for more than a week before anyone was able to get in there. So and there's examples of way longer wait times for some communities in Puerto Rico. So that's another really important aspect of it. Build relationships and how important they are. If you want to add.
Yeah, I would add too. I mean, there are some things that are applicable. There are some things that are less applicable. Just the reality of a territory and the different governance structure and the lack of empowerment at the local level in that regards. One thing that was maybe perceived and reiterated time and time again was when the president made the comment of there's a lot of water in between us, and that was perceived as a critiquable comment, if that's a word. We need to recognize we're more than twice the distance that Puerto Rico is from Florida. That's us to California. And I tried to stress that in that sharing that same composite map. I mean, it's a reality. And the reality of what point in time we are in our just-in-time delivery of goods and services can really affect what any kind of store of food or water that we might actually have. So all of the things that we hear from our local emergency managers and our state emergency managers about individual and family and home preparedness should really be taken to heart We were speaking with a former chief resilience officer for San Juan, and she said the island context is really just different. So the lessons and the way things do work when you're able to share across a Gulf region are just not the same here. So really stressing the reality of our need to be as much as possible individually prepared to withstand or hold out for some period of time. We heard from people that there are a lot of community heroes out there, and they, you know, the next day they got chainsaws, they're running around terrified of getting hurt and having recognizing the limitations of being able to get care if you like strain a muscle or cut a limb. So there were some people that kind of just hold up and just tried to wait it out because of the reality of exposing yourself to some of these conditions. I don't know. We actually just had a brown bag lunch with some of the students today to talk about this. There's a lot to digest still, but that's why we think the island lesson is very important. And while there still are things we can learn from Irma and Florida and Harvey in Texas, it is different. We heard some other great stories about, in essence, like the equivalent of Matson in Puerto Rico had done a lot of stuff that they were almost self-reliant in their terminal area. The day after the storm, 60% of the staff showed up. The second day, 90% of the staff showed up because they, as an employer, were also able to provide goods and services, laundry. They're fortunate that they were literally receiving distribution of goods and services that they could then give to families and friends. So some of the small business continuity stuff, or even thinking about the larger role and responsibility of employers, are things that we're trying to understand as well. Okay. Yeah.
Question is, how is Puerto Rico capturing all the like informal response and recovery that happens at the community level? Because it sounds like there was a lot of that. And is it just like anecdotes and stories? How do people capture and understand that?
I would say the sort of like the joint operations of all the federal agencies and local workforce are not able to capture that. They're not able to slow down and think about those kinds of lessons. But we were fortunate that we saw several presentations from students through the University of Puerto Rico, psychology students, social work students that are going out there and doing those community surveys and trying to document both those good stories, but also the real emotional trauma that people are still dealing with and some of the early symptoms of PTSD. But I think we'll probably learn more out of those kinds of case studies than waiting for some kind of Puerto Rico emergency management report about local community action. It's just my guess.
Yeah, no, I think it's accurate. There is interest at the government level in collecting case studies and success stories, but they're overwhelmed and busy, understandably. So yeah, a lot of it's happening in academia at the university level. A lot of good work is happening at UPR, University of Puerto Rico. So that's one of those vehicles to do that.
Is your hunch that sorry, am I allowed to ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Of course.
It's very tough. Is your hunch that in Puerto Rico, the response at the community level, these like informal first responder type of people, was greater than the more formalized response from the government?
I don't really have a sense, and Rob's been there more times than I have. We only went to 2 locations really, San Juan, Greater Metro San Juan, and then this other city called Rincon, which some of the images are from. I think there's also like a threshold of where people are better able, like a number that people are better able to like know who their neighbor is and communicate and work that way. If you think about like, you know, I live in the Macaulay-Moili area, but my connections are my friends that perhaps live in other neighborhoods. My social strength within my own condo is pretty weak. But then you get these smaller communities that are like 20,000 people, 30,000 people. You could think of like one of our valleys as a discrete unit. There's more ties. And that's what we're really seeing even here locally. You know, you could go to DEM, Department of Emergency Management's website. They have a volunteer and a community tab, and you see all these different preparedness groups popping up. Some of them are called like Strong Community X, Preparedness Y, because they just have the local champions that are like, I want to know who's elderly, I want to know who's impaired, I want to know who has a chainsaw, I want to know who has a bat, any of that stuff. We want to get a shipping container and store it and work with a private landowner to waive all sorts of liability rules. So like, you know, these Hau'ula groups, these Kailua groups, these EVA groups are really building. And I think that was partly sort of kickstarted by city effort, but once some of that capacity was up and running, they're the ones that are best able to form their own organizations, become nonprofits, get grants, get resources, because the reality is, as much as the plans and policies will be in place to clear roads and distribute things, it could take time. Mm-hmm. So what's the way to stopgap that gap in the ability to get resources out?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say those informal responses are better. I don't think maybe that's not the word, but it supplements the government response, because government can only do so much, and really they're only supposed to do so much. They're not supposed to fix everything, and they can't be everywhere at the same time. So that kind of informal community level actions, those are really important to fill that void, but kind of supplement the kind of bigger efforts.
I'll just wrap it up with the last comment, if that's okay. So we're talking a lot about response right now, right? And that's actually not the objective of our study. Our objective is to think about, you know, recovery after the fact, but we also don't want to lose sight of the mitigation. So I'm going to make a plug. The state is wrapping up their 5-year pre-disaster hazard mitigation plan. City and county is about to kick off its effort probably next month. And these are important. We're learning now through some of the hazards and declarations that have come on through the April flooding, and we need to be better prepared to take advantage of when some of these funding opportunities come. You know, what are the actions that we've wished we had always done? What are the new things that we think we want to do? What are the actions that could really limit and mitigate the risks that we have today? I'm planning biased, so like Rob, I have an urban planning background. And to me, response is not planning, right? Response is critically important for the operations immediately. But if we recognize the vulnerabilities like Rob identified through some of those maps, are we just gonna sit and wait? Or are there more proactive, mitigative things that we can do to limit those vulnerabilities? So follow along at DEM's website. Hopefully there'll be information available about the city's hazard mitigation plan. If not, very likely our website will also be sharing a lot of information on that.